Hey everybody, and welcome to another video from the Electronic Armory. In this video, we're going to continue our series in iOS development in Swift 4 by introducing you to web services using Alamo Fire to pull down the Bitcoin price off of an API and display that to our user. So let's get started. So I went ahead and created a single view application for our project, and we're simply going to use this to display the current price of Bitcoin in our application. So to start that off, we're going to go to our main storyboard file and wait for this to load. And we're going to have a place for the price to be displayed. So I'm going to simply use a label for that. So if you just type in label in your filter and get this kind of centered here, what we're actually going to do is make this text a lot larger than it is by default. So let's jump into the attributes section of our inspector on the right hand side here and start affecting the different changes here. Normally we don't want to have text or any kind of font be a pure black. We kind of want to make it either slightly lighter than black or what have you. So this one you can see if we drag it all the way to the right, we actually kind of want to drag this to the left just to make it kind of lighter. That'll be a little bit easier on the eyes. And the next thing we want to do is our font size. So if you click on this T here, it'll allow us to change either from system font or to a custom font. I think the system font is fine for now, but we're going to go ahead and increase the size of that font to something that looks a little bit more appropriate for our price. And I can't really tell, so let's go ahead and change this from label to say a price. And the current price for Bitcoin, this will probably wildly change depending upon when you're watching this video. Right now it's at $3,700. So let's put that in and see if that fits, which it does not. And so let's drag this out a little bit. And actually, I'm just going to drag it out the full width here. And then I'm going to center it. And that looks pretty good. I think I even want to make the style bold or maybe semi-bold. Yeah, that looks pretty good. And you can play around with it however you want it to be. Maybe that's a little bit too bold. Heavy looks good. So anyway, it's all of preference, and of course you can have additional information like history down here, but this looks pretty good. I'm going to control click to do leading space, trailing space, vertical space, or top space to safe area, and that's all we have to do for the constraints. So no matter what device it is on, these constraints will pretty much look the same. We can also check this out by clicking down here and seeing what it would look like on an iPad. iPad Pro and iPad 12.9 inch, as well as way down here, I think this is a iPhone 4S, and it all looks pretty good, and our $3,700 fits on there. Now, if you're watching this years in the future, maybe the price is up to $10,000, and that still fits. Up to $99,000, who knows, maybe in 10, 20, 30 years it'll get up to that high, but that all fits. So that looks good. Way on the iPhone 4, the iPhone 10. Give that a second. And yeah, everything looks good. So let's go ahead with that. And if you do need multi-line labels, we have the ability to do that as well. But let's move on in our application. So I'm going to open up our assistant view here to get the view controller back here. And I need a reference to this label. And I'm just going to call this price label. This is, again, going to be the price of our Bitcoin. And so now what we can do is we can change the value of this price label to text. And starting off, when we launch the application, we're going to put something in there that's kind of nice. Maybe we'd want to pop up a loader activity indicator or something like that to let the user know that we're actually going off to the internet and loading the price and bringing it back. So when the view loads and before it gets onto the screen, I'm going to just put these these ellipses here. All right, so the API that we're going to use is coming from CoinDesk. They offer a free API that we can simply pull data from. And you can see that currently Bitcoin is $3,757. Ethereum, which is another popular cryptocurrency, is up to 280. It's up 7%, 4%. In full disclosure, I'm invested in both of these cryptocurrencies as well as other investments, but I'm not recommending you buy any of this stuff unless you absolutely know what you're doing. But this is just going to be a fun exercise in how to get the prices automatically from them. So what CoinDesk offers, again, is an API that we can pull from this URL, and it'll pass back this data. And in this data is JSON. If you've never seen this, this is just JavaScript object notation. But what it gives us is the time, and what the time is the time that you currently pulled this. So we might actually want to display this in our application to let the user know that this is fresh data rather than maybe yesterday's data and it hasn't updated or pulled the new price yet. Finally, what we actually want is the Bitcoin price index here. And so we have a code for the US dollar. It gives us the symbol which will append to the rate, and the rate is 37.57 and 70 cents, and then just a quick description for that. So we're going to pull this data into our application, but how do we do that? Let me introduce you to a library, a favorite library of ours called AlmoFire. AlmoFire is just a very easy way to pull data from the internet and bring it into your application using a few lines of code. Now I'm going to show you one simple way to install this, but if you scroll down on this page, you can get this from the GitHub /almofire/almofire, and it'll show you how to install it via CocoaPods. I highly recommend CocoaPods, but for this video, we're just going to do a quick install using the manual method, not with the Git, pulling it from Git. I'm just going to simply download the library. Finally, if you scroll down far enough, how we actually use it. So with one line of code, it'll actually pull the data and put it into a response object. And then we can use that response object to pull out the value and do some stuff with it. So very easy and very quick to pull that data. So to download it, if you're not familiar with Git, no problem. We just go to this big green button called clone or download. And if we drop that one down, we can copy the Git address here, or we can simply download it as a zip file. Okay, and so once you have that here, I'm going to open it up in Finder, and here are the AlmoFire project files. Now this is all open source. You get complete access to the source code as well as the Xcode project to build the framework. Now what's most important here is that we copy these files into our Bitcoin application folder, and then there's a couple other steps that you can read about that's outlined in the manual section of how to install AlmoFire, but we're going to cover this just really quickly. Now, a quick tip to access the folder that your project's in without having to navigate to it is if you switch back to your Xcode project and just right-click on any one of these files and say Show in Finder, that will open up another Finder window with your assets in here. And so what I want to do is I'm going to put this into the root directory of our application here, and I am going to copy and paste this in here just because I might want to use this library later. And especially if you pulled this from Git, you can update your Git repository by doing a git pull, and that'll update to the latest version of AlmoFire, and then you can put it in here, though I recommend going the CocoaPod method. All right, so once those files are in there, what we're going to do is find the almofire.xcode project file, and click and drag that and drag it into pretty much anywhere within our Xcode project for our Bitcoin application. All right, so once that's done, what we need to do is build the project by hitting Command B, or we can simply drop down this product menu and go for a build, and you can see the shortcut there is Command B. What that'll do is that'll actually build the AlmoFire project that's now living inside of our other project, and that will go ahead and build the framework so that we can then link it to our Bitcoin project file. So we have a Bitcoin project file here, Almo project file here. Make sure that this one is selected, and I'm just going to go back to our editor view so that this takes up the full screen, and scroll all the way down to this kind of light gray area here called Linked Frameworks and Libraries. I'm going to hit this plus here to add some items, and you'll see right at the top here inside of our workspace we have a couple AlmoFire frameworks to choose from. Make sure you choose the iOS version because we also have a version for a Mac OS application, watchOS, etc. If you do not see these, try building your project first, but I usually build the project and this always comes up. So once that's built and you have this linked, go ahead and add that, and you should see it down here in your linked frameworks and libraries. All right, so once you do that, we can go back to our view controller here, and we're simply going to import that module. So just type in import and AlmoFire. Okay, and I'm going to give that a quick build, so Command B. Okay, so once we now have the AlmoFire module installed, we can now start to use it. So in our view did load, we can do almofire.request, and we have several different requests in here. To keep it simple, we're just going to choose that first one. And if you remember for our API from CoinDesk, we're going to use this API, but the API that they have listed is here. And this is nice because this is an HTTPS call. And so we're going to switch back here and simply paste that in to this request. And what that's going to do is pass back a JSON object. So we want to get a response for JSON, and we have different types of responses. We can get data if it's some kind of binary data, a JSON data, or something else like a string or something. So data that we're interested in is JSON, because what AlmaFire will do is parse this automatically for us. All right, so once we have that, it's actually going to put in a completion handler here. And so the way that we're going to do this shorthand is we're going to delete that completion handler, and we're just going to start the body of the completion handler, let's see, by doing some curly braces here. And after the curly braces, we're going to do response in. And that just gets rid of all that other extra junk and puts the data that's returned from the web server in response. And so let's go ahead and try to print this response out and see what we get. So I'm going to switch this over to an iPhone X and compile. Okay, so you can see our three dots that popped up here as it's loading. Again, maybe we want to have an animation or something. But since we printed this out, we can take a look at what our response is. And that looks pretty good. Obviously, it says success, so that's good. But what's more important is the data that's actually returned. So if you remember, we have the Bitcoin price index in euro, in pounds, and in US dollars here, and a couple of other pieces of information such as the time, etc. So this is looking pretty good. Now what we need to do is extract this first object, because we want this object out of our response so that we can display, namely, our rate here. So I'm going to hit Command-Shift-Y to get rid of that debug window, and let's start pulling out that data from our response. So I'm going to keep that print statement here just to make sure everything is still working. And what I'm going to do is we're going to do an if statement, because maybe that comes back, maybe the server's down and it comes back as either 404 not found, or there's a server error 500, etc. So we want to make sure that this data is actually valid. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to assign it to a JSON object. So this will be called Bitcoin JSON, because it's going to be raw JSON. And I'm going to set that equal to the response dot result. So that's the result that's in that response dot value. And I'm going to start my if statement here. And what this is going to say, this is kind of funny syntax if you've never seen this before, is if, and we're going to assign this variable. And so the variable is going to be assigned to this Bitcoin JSON object. But if that doesn't happen, if it comes out as nil, then we're going to skip over this and we don't have to worry about this. Okay, so we have the JSON object. The next thing we want to do is create an object that is a dictionary so that we can directly manipulate that. So let's put that into an object called Bitcoin object. Okay, and that is going to be of type dictionary. We want to do this explicitly so that we can use the built-in Swift functions and Xcode's autocomplete for this. So this is going to be based off of the Bitcoin JSON that we're getting, and we're simply just going to typecast it as a dictionary. This dictionary is going to be of key value pairs. So the key is going to always be a string, because that's how JSON is defined. The key is always a string, but the value can be of any type. It could be another string, it could be another object, it could be a number, that sort of thing. So we're going to explicitly do this so that we can then use our Bitcoin object here. Let's go ahead and run this. I'm going to print this out to see what it looks like. Okay, and then I'm also going to put down a print statement down here because I want to show you the order of execution for this. So I'm going to simply just put in loading web services or web service, and let's put a breakpoint here so it'll stop there, and also a breakpoint inside and outside. And let's go ahead and run this. All right, so let's scroll down so we can see all of our code. It's going to execute line 24. If I step over that line, it's going to go to the end and then do our print statement, because what's going to happen is it went out to the internet now and it's currently downloading the information. And when that happens and when it's completed, it'll come back and execute this inner code. So let me go ahead and hit continue. And a second or two later, it'll come back and say, I have the response in this response. You can go ahead and investigate it, see all the stuff that we have in here. I'm going to print that out to our console here, which looks pretty good. So this is the format of our JSON object. We're going to want to pull out the BPI object, And then inside the BPI object, there's a USD object. Inside that USD object, there are a bunch of values that we want to pull out, namely the float, the rate float, which has the value without commas, which is kind of important. And unless you want that comma in there, that's fine. And then the symbol if we wanted to dynamically convert this into a $sign. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is I'm going to actually remove that print statement, and then because it would eventually get executed. Now I want to get the BPI object out of that so then I can pull out the USD. So let's say BPI object, and this is also of type dictionary, and this comes from our Bitcoin object. So we're going to do the Bitcoin object, and inside the Bitcoin object, of course, there is that BPI key, and this is going to be typecast as a dictionary, and key is string, and the value for that dictionary is any. Okay, so once we have that, we're going to pull out our USD object out of this. So USD object, which is also of type dictionary, and this is going to be Bitcoin object, or excuse me, BPI object, which is coming from this. I'm just going to copy and paste that, and we're going to pull out the USD object here, and that's going to be of type dictionary as well. I'm just going to copy that as well. Okay, there we go. So then out of our USD object, if you remember, we have that rate float that we need. So I'm going to pull out the rate float. Just going to call that rate, and that rate is a string now. So there's our key, but we have to pull that out from the USD object. Okay, and again, that is of type string, so we're going to typecast that as a string. So let's go ahead and create a rate float object just to make sure that we know that it's a float and not just the string. And we're going to use the constructor for float, and we're going to simply pass in the rate string, and we're going to need to unwrap that as well. And once we have that, let's go ahead and build it just in case we have any compiler errors. Okay, it looks good. And then I'm going to do self price label, because we have to let this inner block know that we're referring to the class instance of price label, just because of our scoping for this. This now has a text variable on it, and we're going to put in the flat rate, but we're going to make this into a string, or a formatted string, I should say. So we have the $sign and then the rate float value. So let's go ahead and run this and see if everything's working fine. Okay, so this illustrates a perfect example of what happens sometimes when working with web services. Now I put in the USD as lowercase, and I really shouldn't have done that. What I should have done is copied and pasted this in. I want to illustrate another point is usually I create static variables for this, or constants. So K for constant, but we want to have one for our BPI. And let me just make sure that's lowercase, which I think it is. Copy, paste that in there. Static let K USD equals capital USD. Static let K, and then the rate float. And I'm just going to copy that for simplicity. I'm just going to call this rate and rate float. Okay, so now that we have those constants, we can copy those in and replace these string literals. We never want to have string literals. The other thing I want to do is, because these are part of the view controller class and static, and we're in our inner block here, not necessarily part of the class that we're in, we have to do view controller dot. So I'm just going to copy that and replace this with .k USD, and then finally the rate float. Okay, and so now we shouldn't get that error, because it was trying to pull out a key that didn't exist. I was saying that it did exist, and then we got the runtime error. So you got to be very, very careful about what you're actually pulling out, because if your API changes where you're trying to pull out stuff that doesn't exist, maybe you're getting a 404 and you're still trying to pull out the data as if it does exist. All right, so we have one more error. Let's see what that is. Okay, so the rate float is actually coming out as a float, not as a string. So let me go ahead and typecast that as a float. float. And if you look at the data here, it did look like it was coming out as a string. So my apologies for that. And let's go ahead and get rid of that because we no longer need to typecast it as a float. And perfect. So something you have to be careful of is even when you're looking at the JSON for it in the console, Swift is actually, and Xcode is actually formatting this in a little bit of different manner. So this is the rate float, and it looks like it's a string, and it's not. And a better way of looking at this JSON code that comes back is to actually open up an application called Postman, and we can take our string URL, go to Postman. This is a great application for doing all of our RESTful application stuff here. So we can do a get, we can do a post if you have an API that you're working against. If I paste in that endpoint to get that data, again, it's a get, I'm going to send that request, and the response is this. And if we change this from auto to JSON, we can see that same exact value. Now this is a lot better because this is the raw JSON in a nice formatted method. And of course it refreshed on me. So the rate float, as you can see, is indeed an actual number. The rate float here is a number, etc. Whereas the rate, if we were to use that value, has that comma in it. And because it's a comma, it's no longer a number. And so now it has to be wrapped in string quotes. So again, just be careful with your data format. But I did want to show you that because I use Postman all the time for manipulating and working with an API before pulling it into Swift. And one of the really great features of Postman is that you can actually convert this, this request into Swift or any other language that you can think of. So in order to do that, you go up to this little tiny little button called Code, and you click on that, and then you can get the HTML code for it, or you can get all these other libraries. And so let's go find Swift, which is right here at the bottom. And it's going to use a slightly different manner than Alamo Fire, but if you don't really mind, you can just go ahead and do this. It'll set up your headers for you. The actual request object, which you can see is kind of similar as Alamo Fire. The request type is a get. Some of these you don't need, but it's going to be very explicit because if we changed it from a get to a put or a post, that would change the code here. And so I could, if I wanted to, copy and paste all of this instead of Alamo Fire. But you can see one of the reasons why I use Alamo Fire is it's a little bit more concise and easier to work with than all of this. But it's there, as well as all these other ones as well. All right, so the next thing that you may want to do is add the date below it, maybe in smaller text so it fits on the screen, and then also a refresh button, which simply goes back and re-executes this Alamo Fire request again and again and again. I'll leave those exercises up to you to do on your own. Figure it out. Ask questions in the comment below if you get stuck. Subscribe to this channel if you want to see more content like this. Give it a like if you want to see more iOS development videos. Share this playlist if you think others would like to learn iOS development as well. And stay tuned for more videos on iOS, Android, 3D, game development, and everything else to arm yourself in the digital world. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.